of the Baroque style, you should be able to talk about that and how that was associated with the beginning of this whole era, how it defined the concept of triads and seventh chords, and the term monody, what that has to do with the beginning of the Baroque. So you would look for that in a Baroque concerto. You'd look to see if there was figure bass. If you see figure bass, that's going to be a pretty clear indicator it's a Baroque work. Or early classical, maybe. Think Baroque. And some other things that you could look for. Okay, I'll ask you to make a comment about the genre. So what do you think you're going to be finding on this example? A concerto. So you want to say what it is. This is a piano concerto. This is a violin concerto. Or this is a whatever, concerto grosso. You also could say something about then whether or not this is the first movement or third movement versus the second movement. How could you make that kind of statement? Okay.
Things like the tempo.
Tempo. So if it's a slow tempo, then you're going to think it's probably which movement? Second movement. If it is a fast tempo, yeah. If it starts out with a rather long orchestral opening, what are you going to think? Probably first movement, probably double exposition. If it starts out with a statement of a theme by either the orchestra or the soloist, but it's rather brief, and then whichever is the opposite answers it, you know, so let's say it starts out with the orchestra presenting a theme, like in the Beethoven fourth last movement, and then piano responds to it by stating the same theme again, that's probably going to be a rondo movement. So as far as guessing, you know, what the form could be, you can have a good clue based on whether or not it's a fast movement or slow movement, okay? So if it's a fast movement, it's probably double exposition if it starts out with that long orchestra opening section. Rondo if it starts out with a statement of a theme that's answered by the other number. All right. So some other things that you could write about would have to do with like performance directions. So look to see what is in the score. Do you have, you know, lots of articulation indications, lots of directions, or not? Or does it not even have a tempo marking? And doesn't have anything except piano and forte, maybe. That would indicate what style. Baroque. So let's see what else we got. Yeah, you can make some kind of statement about the emotional aspect. Does it sound, you know, is it more of a classic sense of restraint? Or is it more emotionally extroverted, like the Brahms concerto that we just heard? That's very intense. All right, we've got about 3 minutes. You should know the term Fortespino, what that has to do with. The two main types of Baroque concerti are concerto grosso and solo concerto. Comparing and contrasting ritornello form with double exposition. Basically, it's just the difference of having one theme in the ritornello concerto versus contrasting themes. And that's the main idea with the form. There are other things that are different with the, you know, the instruments, the orchestration, and so forth. I talked about the more conservative approach, which Brahms was more conservative in approaching concerto. So it wasn't as explicitly, dominated by the soloist part, like you have in a Paganini concerto or a Chopin concerto. But it was more of an equal partnership with orchestra and soloist. And the two virtuosi that were really important at the beginning of the Romantic era were Paganini and Liszt. So Paganini, the great violinist, and Liszt, the pianist. The middle class in Europe really liked that whole matinee idol element, that's the charisma of these performers. And so they, paid to go see them because they had so much personal magnetism and were such masters of their instrument. And so you had lots of people that imitated that style, and it became really, really popular. And so the middle class, because they would support that, really promoted that idea of the virtuoso in the 19th century. So that two innovations in the Beethoven Fourth, first movement starts out with a statement of the A theme at the piano before the orchestra even begins. And that the soloist continues to play after the cadenza in the first movement, all the way to the end of the movement. So that's something that's not as typical in a Mozart, although you can see some examples of that in Mozart, actually. So the three most important genres of Tchaikovsky were symphonies, concerti, and ballet music. So, characteristics of Brahms' compositional style, basically with the concerto, we just talked about the symphonic element, polarity of voices, that emphasis on outer voices. So now that, that term scherzo was what he labeled the second movement, but it was not the form. It wasn't scherzo trio form, but it had to do with the character of the movements. So, a scherzo that's in a minor key is real dramatic. Okay. So be sure you read through the bios again of these six composers. I'll have a couple of questions taken from that. So read through that in the text. So do you have any questions? Okay.
It said, able to define and give early history of the concertato principle.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't find when it was developed.
This developed at the end of the 16th century. So this was the style associated with the Venetian polychoral music, and so that Giovanni Gabrieli was probably the most famous composer from that. So that term concertato or concertant just is synonymous with antiphonal. So the concertato style is the antiphonal style. Okay? So we'll see you